Nebraska lawmakers introduced legislation to ban abortion 6 weeks into a pregnancy. Now, if passed, it would be one of the most restrictive abortion laws for a state that hasn't outright banned the procedure.
Tonight, 6 News' Brian Mastery breaks down the details of the bill and why supporters of abortion rights call the bill extreme.
A trigger ban banning abortion in Nebraska failed by 2 votes last year in the Nebraska legislature. Governor Ricketts also didn't have the votes to call a special session. Will this year be any different?
But several. I believe I do.
State Senator Joni Albright gathered a number of Nebraska senators in the rotunda of the state capitol today to reveal anti-abortion legislation. 33 votes would prevent a filibuster. That's how Democratic senators blocked a total ban last year. This bill would ban abortions except in the earliest weeks of pregnancy.
The 3 exemptions are, of course, rape, incest, and the life-saving measures of a mother.
Nebraska currently allows abortions up to 20 weeks. Ever since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade last year, supporters of abortion rights have voiced their concerns as several states have enacted more restrictions. Specifically, the latest Nebraska bill would ban abortion once cardiac activity is detected in an embryo, often around the 6th week of pregnancy.
A 6-week abortion ban is an abortion ban. It effectively bans abortion for everybody because a lot of people don't even know they're pregnant until after 6 weeks.
That decision belongs with women and their doctors. It does not belong with politicians.
Those on the anti-abortion side said the bill would not include criminal penalties for women or the doctors. However, doctors could lose their medical license if they're in violation.
And there is nothing in this bill that prevents me or any doctor from providing appropriate and necessary medical care to a pregnant woman, or from terminating a pregnancy in the rare and tragic instance when the mother's life is at stake.
Abortion rights supporters say women need safe, legal, and available services, and that this bill does the opposite of that. On your side in Lincoln, Brian Mastery, 6 News.
The bill doesn't have a number attached to it yet because it hasn't been officially filed, but we do have a copy of it posted on our website. That's WOWT.com.